Okay, it's time to commit. 2024 is the year for prioritizing yourself. Begin your new smile journey with Byte, and you could start seeing results in just 2 to 3 weeks. Just order your at-home impression kit today for only $14.95 at Byte.com. Byte clear liners are doctor-directed and delivered to your door. Treatment costs thousands less than braces, plus they offer financing options, accept eligible insurance, and you could pay with your HSA, FSA. Get 80% off your impression kit when you use code WONDERY at Byte.com. That's BYTE.com. Start your confidence journey today with Byte.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
What is The Briefing Room? It's a behind-the-scenes look at how the criminal justice system works and the lives of the people within that system.
If you love true crime, well, these are the real people who do the job every day of making sure justice is served.
Hi, I'm Detective Dave.
I'm Detective Dan. Together we have decades of experience in local law enforcement, a profession that we think is often misunderstood.
So we're going to explore how to do it right, and we won't shy away from when it's done wrong. These are stories you'll hear nowhere else. Unique, frank, and unvarnished.
From the team that brought you Small Town Dicks, this is The Briefing Room. Episode 1 drops on August 30th.
We'll meet you in the briefing room.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.
And welcome back to Scarred for Life, the podcast where we open up old wounds by looking back at the films that scared us as kids. I'm Terry.
And I'm Mary Beth.
In each episode, our special guest brings with them a movie that traumatized them as a child.
This week, our guest is Andrew Traucki, the director of films like The Reef, Blackwater, and the new standalone, The Reef Stalked, which will be in theaters and streaming on Shudder July 29th. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Really excited to chat with you. I'm a huge fan of shark movies. I'm a huge fan of creature features. Your career has been a lot of that. So I'm curious how you got interested in like sharks and alligators and the jaguars and all of the things that you've filmed.
Yeah, well, I do live in Australia and we do seem to have our fair share of deadly animals. You know, I'm pretty sure everyone in America thinks if you come here, you're going to either get knocked over by a kangaroo or eaten by a shark. So yeah, I mean, it was a kind of natural extension of living here, but also, yeah, well, we had crocodiles. So I tell you how the genesis of, how my first film got made was that I was trying to make a low budget thriller horror. And, I was watching Open Water because that's, to me, was a great film that was done for very little. And my kids from their uncle had been given a blow-up crocodile. I don't know why, but go figure. But anyway, and there it was sitting in the living room. And as I was watching it, I saw it and I went, oh, my goodness, Australia's got lots of crocodiles. There's another top-level predator. And so I started researching and found this great story, sad story, but interesting story about a real story about these people have been chased up a tree and had to get out of the water because there was a crocodile down below. And that's how that kicked off. So I guess that was my first start. And, I've made a few since then.
It's funny because you talk about how a lot of Americans are afraid of coming and they're going to be eaten like by a shark or whatever. But here's the two things. I want to go to Australia to be in a tank and go see great white sharks. That's one thing I want to do. But the thing that stops me is that you have these giant ass spiders on the land that I'm so afraid are going to kill me.
Yeah. There's one that's not nice, which is called the funnel web. Yeah, that's they've got an anti-venom now, so you'll be right.
Okay, good. So I can go to jump in the very, very safe cage and I'll be safe from the spiders. Okay.
Right, yeah. It'll be all right.
I think you'll be fine.
So I wanted to, can you tell listeners a little bit about The Reef Stalked and what it's about?
Yeah, sure. So look, it's a film that, it's a shark thriller, survival story, but it's also, I'm really big on elevated thrillers, ones that sort of trying to get your mind going as well as your fear instinct. So this film, I tried to do both those things. I tried to give it the genre engine, keep it as a really interesting, exciting, suspenseful ride, but also to get people thinking about grief, loss, and domestic violence. And the reason I could do that with this film is that I'm a surfer, and surfers call the shark, I don't know if they do in America, but I think they might, the man in the grey suit. So
I love that line in the movie.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? They call him Noah, or all these names for the sharks, but that one's the one that really stuck out for me. And so therefore I felt I could make this film, start with, domestic violence and then go onto the water, and the shark could become the allegory for that. So that's sort of how it all sort of started for me. And that was interesting to me because I'm not really drawn to sort of the more, shark exploitation films, shark films. Like, I mean, they're fine, they've got their place, but that's not for me. I'm more about suspense and horror, and so that was the sort of the gateway that led me into writing this.
Well, I do think that a lot of the shark films that are most memorable to me kind of use the shark as almost like a metaphor. I mean, you mentioned like Open Waters, and there's the one of the subtext is their relationship and how it's kind of deteriorating throughout the movie. And in The Shallows, it's also kind of grounded in the grief of the character's mom. And Jaws even is, you could look at it as like a fear of, the kind of Cape Town island where it's like, if one bad season happens, everyone could lose it. And that shark becomes that kind of capitalism eating machine. And so I loved how in this one, it's grounded in that domestic violence aspect of it and follows through with that. That was one thing that really drew me to this one.
Great.
I'm also curious about the use, because I know in The Reef you used real sharks. Did you use real sharks in this one as well?
Yeah, we did. We, another part of my shtick is I want to keep it as real as possible. There's always this Stephen King quote in the back of my mind, which is, once you see the zipper down the monster's back, the game's over. And so, I really, really believe keeping it real is helpful. For me, that was using real sharks. Yeah.
How do you go about filming that?
Would love to hear more about how that was accomplished.
Yeah, I'm sure you would. I do have to keep some secrets up my sleeve. Otherwise, what I love, because that question comes up a lot, and that makes me think, well, that's good. They're thinking about it, but I don't want to give the answer away to that one.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. But the water photography is really stunning of the sharks. I love the cinematography in this movie.
Thank you.
Go on. No, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to launch into the fact that it was all shot on location, not in a tank. So, we were at the mercy of the weather. It did rain. We did have gale force winds come through.
Oh, wow.
Continuity for the clouds was sometimes an issue. And we really did have a real life shark on set one day, which was, luckily we were on the beach, and luckily it was only a small reef shark. But, this fin just dribbled by or passed by, and everyone went, "Oh my God, there's a shark."
Wow.
Art imitates life, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. Yeah.
Really quick, I love that you used found footage in one of your films, The Jungle, and I'm curious about like what drew you to using the found footage technique in one of your movies. As a huge fan of that, I was excited to see it.
Oh, good. I'm glad you like them. I really wanted the challenge. Oh, look, to be honest, also, they're easier to finance. So typically a film to finance in Australia takes years to raise the finance, and I got impatient and just thought I can probably finance this through, my own means, and so that was one reason. But I was really drawn. After seeing Paranormal Activity, and when they're done right, they're just very compelling, and like this whole thing of reality, I just love that aspect of it. So the fact that they're this pseudo documentary really interests me, and then just the challenge of doing them, because when you're doing something like that, because it's meant to be real, you can't use score, and thrillers rely on score so much. You can't, the editing is meant to be continuous. So so there's all these things you can't really use. You can't use high production values, which is what distributors and sales agents hang their, what they sell a film from. So it was the idea of the reality, the fact that I could probably do one quickly, and just a new challenge in directing that, and the story. Of course, that sort of drew me to it. Yeah,
Cool.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked us a question about the jungle. It gets forgotten amongst
It does, and I
does.
rewatched it recently, and it's really effective. I love. There's the one shot, I think, towards the middle of the movie where the creature kind of thing is revealed, and there's the glowing eyes and everything. I love that. I love that movie.
Yeah, right. Me too.
I'm curious. I have to ask about the last movie that you directed, though, the Blackwater Abyss, because that one kind of reminded me of like The Descent with alligators, and it just what was that like filming that movie in kind of like darkness and in claustrophobic areas?
Yeah. No, that was in water too. That was difficult. But yeah,
you don't make it easy for yourself.
No, I don't. I really wish somebody give me a script. If it says it's on dry land, I'll be halfway to signing. Yeah, no, that was interesting, and I really wanted, apart from the water, I'm glad you say about the claustrophobia, but also because of the lighting. Like I find some films that pretend or want to be in dark places, they overlight it. So we used LEDs, this new technology in lighting, which was really helpful. And I think the DP did a fantastic job of getting the lighting right because, constantly the producers and everybody going, oh, don't make it too dark, they won't be able to see, which is true. You don't want it so dark that you're straining your eyes, a bit like that episode of Game of Thrones, which is a bit difficult.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
But at the same time, you are in a dark place with only available light as your light source. So, yeah, we went to a lot of trouble to get that lighting in that nice sweet spot where it felt real, but it wasn't so dark that people couldn't see stuff. But, yeah, that was pretty tricky. I mean, that one was done in a tank in a studio, so at least we didn't have to worry about whether it was raining and sunny and all those sorts of things.
To deal with actual caves.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that kind of ties that movie to what I really liked about Reef Stalked is the use of not knowing what's underneath you and not being able to see that, because a lot of the tension in the Reef Stalked, and well, I mean, in all of your movies, honestly, but I noticed it as I was watching this, I was getting like so anxious because you can't see what's underneath the water, right? And that was the thing that like really worked well in Abyss, because it's so dark in there and anything could happen at any moment. And I think that when used effectively, it's such a good technique.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, look, I certainly agree with you that, and once again, to go to Stephen King, he has this quote that I pull out, which is, the monster at the top of the stairs behind the door is more scary than the monster at the top of the stairs in front of the door, because, no matter what we do, the mind is going to create a much more scary, spooky scenario than the filmmaker probably is, because our mind is just that much more imaginative and worried, and the mind's always constantly trying to figure out what's going on, where what it loves puzzles. So my thinking is exactly that. Show the threat and then just hide it or wonder where it is, and the audience's mind is going to do the work for you. They're going to be going, oh my God, it's coming. No, it's not. Oh, maybe it is. I mean, because that's what I do. And I'm pretty sure that's what most people do in the cinema. So that's the game I like to play, which is set up the suggestion and then you've got to work out when is it going to happen.
I want to take it back very briefly to childhood. Did you watch a lot of horror movies growing up?
To tell you the truth, not really. Some that I did obviously stayed with me, but I'm sort of more drawn to darker thrillers, I guess, than horror, Yeah.
Do you remember what some of the ones that kind of stood out to you when you were a kid watching them?
Oh, wow. Well, I think I mentioned before, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre certainly did some damage. And there's this film, and maybe you can answer it since you guys know all this stuff. I couldn't try to put it together, Google it and get it worked out. And this is, being a kid, what it's like, isn't it? You don't remember the actors of the names, you just remember scenes and bits and fragments. But there's this film, and I can't remember the name, where there's these two kids and they're just mucking around on the phone, ringing up people saying, I know who you are, I saw what you did. And one of them drops, I think it's some jelly or from a sandwich on the number, and they ring back. And the guy's actually just killed his wife or something. And so he gets really paranoid and decides to come and kill them. I really can't remember. It's probably some B-grade. I really don't know much more than that, but I know that really sort of freaked the hell out of me.
Yeah, that would be terrifying.
Yeah.
I'm drawing a blank on it though, but
Yeah,
I am also.
it's funny how kids' memories, like, you get, as you said, pick bits and pieces. And there are movies where I never thought I had seen them. And then I watch them as an adult and I'm like, oh my God, I remember this as a kid.
Yeah.
You just never remember the name.
Or I don't know if you've ever had this where you watch, when you're a kid, you watch something and she was sure that's what happened. And you rewatch the film and go, oh, that's not what happened.
That's not what happened at all. Yeah.
This podcast, especially where you revisit things I haven't seen in a long time, I'm like, that's not how I remember that movie whatsoever.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Wait, is it I Saw What You Did?
It could be. It's not the one about the babysitter who comes back, is in the house. That's a famous one.
No, it's about two girls who make random prank phone calls.
Yeah. That's the one. Is that what it's called? I Saw What You Did?
Joan Crawford.
Wow.
By William Castle. It's from 1965.
I felt more like it was a 70s film, but maybe. I'm going to look that up.
I whisper, I saw what you did and I know who you are to a psychopath who just murdered his wife. That's the storyline. There you go.
Thank you. Your Google skills are much better than mine.
That sounds really interesting, though.
It was when I was a kid. It scared the shit out of me.
Based on a book, apparently. I'm adding this to my list of things to watch when I'm bored.
Yeah.
Well, I guess speaking of movies that scared the shit out of you, Andrew, what movie have you brought with you today for us to discuss that scarred you for life?
Yeah, I've brought Deliverance today, and
oh boy! All right, well, here's a quick summary for those of you unfamiliar with Deliverance. Intent on seeing the Kahulawasi River before it's dammed and turned into a lake. Outdoor fanatic Lewis Medlock, played by Burt Reynolds, takes his friends on a canoeing trip they'll never forget into the dangerous American backcountry.
Yeah. Okay. So, Andrew, take us back. When did you first see this? How old were you? How did you see this? Who let you see this? Give us your horror story. We want to hear it all.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was about 13 or 14.
Wow.
Would have been that sort of age, I guess. Or maybe 12, but I think around there. And it was at my friend's, their house, and VHS hadn't been out for too long, but we, it was in the living room, and we went in, and no one else was there, and we sort of put it on, and scared the shit out of ourselves for a while.
What do you remember about watching it? What were the things that like jumped out at you?
Well, there's obviously the most famous scene, which is Squeal Like a Pig, and that really that scene it probably defines the entire film. Actually, like seeing it again recently, I kind of felt that scene is just massive. It's if that scene hadn't been in that film, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have been that film. That film wouldn't have been as successful as it was, because it was, for the time, it was very confronting, and it's very brutal and raw, and that was that scene. But then also, I guess, the whole setup with the dueling banjos and all those hillbilly sort of looks, they're so real, and you just feel, oh, where are you going? It automatically sets up this dread and threat that you go, oh my God, don't go. What are you letting yourself in for? And it's just purely through characterization, which is brilliant.
Yeah. It's weird thinking about this movie because when I was a kid, I didn't see this until much later. I think probably in my 20s is when I finally saw this movie for the first time. But it's a movie that I think has kind of defined how we think about sort of like the rural hillbilly, music in quotations, redneck, that kind of horror film. I think this movie sort of cemented those of what you expect for them. And all people have to say is go, and you think of redneck horror, you think of hillbilly horror, and it's I think even for I was talking to at my day job, my one of my coworkers, she's an intern, she's 23 years old, she's never seen this movie, and I was like, and she's like, oh, I know that means hillbilly horror, and I was like, see,
wild.
You've never heard of this movie before, and yet that just saying that just evokes images.
It does. It's like if you do the Jaws theme, everyone knows sharks, So, but that dueling, it's such a brilliant scene too, because they do that whole thing, and then the kid won't acknowledge him or do anything, and you just go, "Whoa, you're damaged." It's a great scene because it's got so much joy, and automatically it flips to, "Shit, this is scary."
Yeah. I also really like it because it sort of sets up that expectation, because they go in and the things they say about the rural folk that live there are pretty disparaging. Bobby, the more overweight character, is talking about, I had it written down, talk about genetic deficiencies, ain't that pitiful? And Lewis starts off the thing by talking about the people up here who've never seen a town before, and everyone's like, let's not upset these people. So it definitely sets us as like others them and kind of demeans them, and then all of a sudden this kid whips out the banjo and is like out playing the suburbanites.
But that's also to me like very much like, oh, he's performing for them, and then like, oh, we'll give him some money. It's almost like he proved, oh, you are a person to us. Like, you actually deserve to be acknowledged as a person. And then once the music stops and he goes completely quiet, it's like he loses that again. He loses that humanity.
There's a connection, isn't there? And then there isn't.
Apparently they had to, and you can kind of see it in the shot of the film, apparently they had to have another of the characters stand behind him because the kid really liked the guitar player, and so in order to get him to turn away from it, they had to put the other guy so that he would get like this reaction from not wanting to talk to him.
Right. Wow, it's interesting, isn't it?
The things people do for to get that perfect shot.
They're all lies.
Well, and like, so I had actually just watched this movie for this podcast. I had never seen it before because I did not want to ever watch this movie because of how it was described to me by people, which is saying something, because if people listening to this podcast know me, I love really like fucked up extreme horror movies. But I was watching it today and trying to figure out like, what was it about this movie that made me so like, I don't want to watch this. Like, it feels so dangerous. And I think it's because I had never heard, like, I'm very into rape revenge movies with women as the victims of sexual assault. And so before I was into that kind of research, my stepdad told me about Deliverance when I was younger. And he told me the whole plot of it because he loved to do that. And I was like, absolutely not. I want nothing to do with that. And that was my first, I think, like explicit discussion about sexual assault with a person was about Deliverance, which wow. So then I associated the two together in like a really dark way. And the more I started watching like rape revenge movies with women at the center, I was like, why am I so weird about Deliverance still? And I don't know. I think what I came to today was thinking that like, it's so interesting how this movie is treated versus movies like I Spit on Your Grave, which are obviously like very different in terms of exploitation, but you have like I've seen Spit on Your Grave a couple of times, and they're very similarly structured in terms of like, I think anyway, like going out into the woods and then getting harassed by the locals and then getting kind of revenge or trying to escape. And it's just interesting to see how a movie where the men are at the center of it is so, and again, very different quality movies and made with very different purposes. Yeah. But still, it's just so interesting to see how those two types of movies that have a similar core are thought of so differently, like in the realm of cinema. Because I know Deliverance is like, people talk about it as a classic film.
It was nominated for Academies.
That's what it was. And like, it's a gorgeously shot movie, and like I think it deserves it. But again, it's just interesting to think about like how those two topics are handled between like gender dynamics.
Yeah, but also shot a long time ago, so a sense of gender and that has changed a lot, I think, over those 30 or 40 years. So
for sure. And I know that like in this movie especially, it was so shocking because it's a man raping another man, and like that. Even today, like, is incredibly taboo to discuss, like in the early 70s, especially with characters like Jon Voight and Burt Reynolds in these movies. I mean, like, fascinatingly ahead of its time, maybe. And it's like discussion of toxic masculinity and masculinity. I'm glad I watched it, basically, is what I'm trying to say here. I'm glad. I think I wrongfully avoided it. And I think I'm very glad that I have now experienced it and see it as something more than just a shocking movie, but very complicated.
It is. It's got a lot going on, hasn't it? Because it's got, like you say, the different masculinities or level of masculinity. Obviously, Burt Reynolds being the alpha male, right down to the guy, I've forgotten his name, who gets raped,
Bobby.
Bobby. And that's interesting. Then it's got the whole eco theme through it, a flooded lake, and we're losing touch with nature. And isn't it sad that this whole culture is going to be destroyed by, the lake being flooded. And then, as you said, the whole others, the townspeople versus the urbanites. So, yeah, I feel there's a lot going on in that film.
Yeah, because I think this might be the second time I've seen this movie, and the opening almost monologue from Lewis, where he's talking about how,
yes.
how they're drowning the river, which I think is such an interesting turn of phrase. Because you normally think drowning in people, and people are drowning the river. And he says just about the last unfucked river in the South. And then he says basically that progress is going to rape this whole damn landscape. And so you have that as being like the opening line. And of course, then it progresses down that path of the sexual assault metaphor. But I always think about how it's interesting that this stages these sort of like 4 suburbanites that are trying to, reclaim their sense of masculinity, I guess, in terms of the 70s being sort of like this really kind of interesting microcosm of like, what is a man? And I did find this really interesting article that was written by Isabel Machado she's a Brazilian. I think she was I think she has a doctorate, and she was writing for the Southern Studies at Ole Miss EDU. She has like an obsession with the South and American South. And she was talking about how there was an obsession coming out of the 50s with like that men had become too soft, and that men had like consumerism had like made men more of a couch potato than going out and doing all these things. And what's interesting is I started doing some digging, because she talks about men's magazines, and there were like over 130 different adventure magazines aimed at men that came out in the 1950s. And there's the like list of magazines that were about trying to exude sort of like this kind of toxic identity of like what manly men are. They always had like covers of like men with rippling muscles going after like this defenseless girl. She's like on the cover. They're conquering jungles or anything like that. And they had names like Men's Adventure Magazine, Real Men, Man's Illustrated, not Men, Man's Illustrated, For Men Only, Man's Life, Daring, True. Like all of these magazines that came out that were like trying to, I guess, in a way, reclaim what they thought was masculinity. And it sort of feeds into this idea of, I'm going to go conquer this nature, and we're going to go show that we're not this couch potato type of man.
Yeah, right. Interesting.
But it's, I don't know. It's interesting that the way that this film was sort of framed, because like a lot of the advertising about the film prior to it and after it were like shots of Burt Reynolds, looking all buff, and men talking about how like, they tried to one up each other. There's like this classic shot in Life magazine of John Voight climbing the cliff using no stunt doubles for any of this stuff, because they couldn't afford it.
There you go. He's a real man.
Yeah. It's just, I don't know. It's interesting to me that the timing of this movie coming out in like the 70s, both is sort of like trying to recapture what some people think a man is, and then also like inverting that and subverting that expectation a bit.
Yeah, I think so for sure. I think like we've been talking about, it portrays 4 different roles of masculinity, and I think, without wanting to give much away, the alpha male doesn't really come out the best out of this. So
yeah, because he gets his femur broken, he gets taken, put out of commission, and it's I hadn't even thought about that. There's like different archetypes there, because Ed has the pipe, and you always think about the studious man with the pipe, and then you have the artistic guy with his guitar, and you have the insurance salesman with Bobby, who's a little bit more flabby around the middle, and then there's the alpha male. It's interesting. I hadn't even thought about that.
Interesting. Yeah, I agree.
Well, they even go up to him and they're like, what do we do? And when the whole canoe stuff happens, like, what do we do? You're the fucking man with the answers. What do we do? What do we do? And like, they don't, and he is completely like sobbing and can't even be touched without screaming, and cannot do anything, completely incapacitated. So it is really fascinating. Again, in a movie movie from the early 70s, having these weird inversions of gender dynamics, and also seeing men, but also there's a couple posters that are like very like tender, like the men are like panting and like wet and they look very upset, and it's just very like fascinating tension in this movie that is and like, again, it's like a very interesting look at male friendship that is a little bit first predicated on macho-ness, but also kind of goes into the weird when everything is stripped away, what happens, which again, like we don't see a lot of male friendships portrayed with that kind of complexity in cinema a lot of the time. So, especially for the time period, it's very interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's, and, obviously once he's out of the picture, then who's going to step up, or what are they going to do, that poses a really interesting question too. And of course the moral dilemma of whether or not to come clean and state things properly, or whether to, just make sure they can get out of the place. That's also very interesting too.
There's a lot going on in this film. That whole discussion about what should we do, how do we solve this issue, is much more interesting than I first gave it credit for, because it's talking about their fears of the other in a way, because they're outsiders. So how's it going to look with like a jury of the peers of the killed people, vice people that might be more open to the suburbanites. But then there's also that kind of, I think it kind of implicitly talks about the shame of sexual assault, and inverts it as to why a lot of times sexual assault is not reported, because there is that sense of like, A, nothing's going to get done, B, there's the whole shame about it, because Bobby is like, no, this is never going to leave this place. You're never going to talk about this again. Right. Like that he's almost more concerned about that aspect than anything else.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, once again, you see the pragmatism of Lewis. He just wants a solution that's going to make him okay. Whereas the others are much more concerned with doing the right thing by society. Well, not Bobby. He, like you say, he just wants to forget about it. But the other two they want to do the right thing. And then there's that tug of war about what the right thing is and how to do it. And I found that pretty interesting, because once again, I was thinking, what would I do? Would I side with Lewis or not? And it's a great moral dilemma, because I can see where he's coming from. You do feel threatened after what those people have done to them. It's not like they're just nice people.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and if you have the chance of hiding the bodies in a place that's never going to be found because it's about to be dammed, or the dam's going to be gone away and it's going to just become a lake, like, I don't know. Yeah. It's also interesting to see the set, because it's a very obviously a male dominated set, and I guess fights broke out between John Borman and the screenwriter Christopher Dickey. Apparently they apparently got into fistfights, and there's a rumor that Borman had 4 teeth knocked out.
Oh my God. Don't ever fight with a writer.
Yeah, well, I think like from what I understand, Dickey sort of has a very imposing I think he's very tall, and he was kind of from what I understand, he sort of is like in between, I would say, like Ed, Jon Voight's character, and Lewis, Burt Reynolds' character, where he's a poet, and he's smart, because I think he was like a poet laureate for some time.
Wow.
But he was also this kind of like aggressive alpha male type character. And so I think from what I understand, he got drunk and came on set, and then it became like a bunch of fighting between him and John.
That's insane, isn't it? Wouldn't happen today, I tell you. I'm amazed they let the writer near the set. That's very unusual.
I am too, because you hear about that all the time now, where it's like the writers, they send off their script, and it's like maybe they'll have a set visit once, and that's about it. But apparently he was on set all the time, to the point that the cast wanted him to go because he was very churlish on set.
Good Lord.
I don't think it's a good idea to have the writer there.
I wanted to touch back on something you said, Andrew, about like eco horror in this movie, because I again, first time watching this, didn't realize how much of like an eco horror, environmental horror movie it was. Like I knew it was the rural hillbillies against like the cityites, but that, like we talked about it, Terry, that monologue at the beginning about how everything's going to be wiped out, and how it's almost like this response that is not a good response, obviously, to hurting and killing city folk, but also like they are a threat They do represent this threat to their lives, their culture, and everything. And this movie takes on such an interesting tone when you think of it as an eco horror movie or an environmental horror movie.
Yeah.
And how, what I'm trying to say, how much environmental horror doesn't have to be this like excessive, like monsters or something terrifying, but more like that. This is more of a real look at the terrors of what we do to our environment and how that affects people, and not in a preachy way and not in a super horrific way, but it's a really interesting balance of how this is that Boorman accomplishes it in Deliverance. And I was curious, Terry, have you thought I know we talked about it a little bit about like eco horror.
No, I think it's incredibly precedent, this film. And when you think about what's happening today, and you think, and like you say, he doesn't ram it down your throat. It's not like this is going to be a film about the destruction of the planet, but taking this small thing, the flooding of a river, and what that means, to the loss of that community, to the loss of all that environment. This is all going to be dead. As you said, it's going to be drowned. That to me is like, when I saw that again, I kind of thought, well, isn't that where we are now? Isn't that the problem now? I mean, aren't we climate change and all those things? Aren't we, but on a bigger scale? We've just taken it to the next level. So incredibly precedent when you reflect on it, really, that this film had that as one of its themes. And I think it really also lends itself to that whole, and it's been a theme for a long time, I guess, of man versus nature to a certain degree. It's not like in your face, but that whole thing of, do we tame it or do we try and live with it, which is, I think a central part of our entire existence. We've obviously been trying to tame it for a long time, and hopefully now we're going to try and exist with it a little bit more. And when you think that the 70s were a time of mass exploitation of the planet, like it was prior to any sort of green movement or just the beginning of it, that would have been, I guess, in the writer's mind. But I found it incredibly prescient that it was talking about these things which today is so, well, for me at least, front of mind, that we're destroying our planet.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, that article that I found by Isabel. We're going to include in the show notes, listeners, because it's a fascinating
really
read.
Cool.
But one of the things she talks about is the way in which Georgia, where this is set, was taking a lot of federal subsidies to further industrial development and agricultural subsidies, often to the detriment of the rural areas and the people that were doing the jobs and doing the work, to the point where they were opposing welfare programs while focusing on these things that were making the rich rich and the poorer. And that's kind of, I think, in this movie as well, in terms of, I think it's interesting, the movie opens up kind of with the bulldozers like tearing away at the land. And there was this quote that Christopher Dickey, the writer and the screenwriter, notes that Deliverance plays with the tension between the New South and the Old South, where the New South was Atlanta, the Old South was up in the mountains and was a whole different world. You didn't have to drive far to hit it, but it's this kind of play on like this sort of kind of going into that kind of man versus nature and trying to get back to this idea or this idyllic sense of what the past used to be, while you also are having to deal with this progress that's coming in with the bulldozer to destroy the world, basically, in a way. It's interesting.
I mean, I don't know about you, but certainly here, just the urban sprawl in this country, you got to drive further and further to get into a bit of nature.
Yep, it's true. It's everywhere I look here. There's it's definitely becoming more urbanized.
Before we start wrapping up, can we just briefly talk about the assault scene? Because I think, again, because a lot of my interests are like in how these kinds of moments of violence are framed and filmed and how we are supposed to watch them. And I was very interested about how this one would be filmed. Like, would it be kind of, are we just going to watch it from afar, close-ups, whatever? And so, we have more of the close-ups on the faces of, is it Bobby, the rapist, and then what's John Boyd's Ed? And there's interesting like triangle of people that we flash back and forth, and it's all about who is watching who. And I think that to me really got to me in my head. It got to me in terms of how that was framed as, we're obviously very intimately viewing this violence, but they're not showing us like the act itself, which I think, when movies involving rape do that, it's always such an interesting choice. And I love to think through that and kind of, this is already such a violation for so many reasons. And focusing on these faces makes it much more, I think, personal and much more harrowing, rather than just like this centerpiece of violence that we're all just going to move on from, but rather like really show that the emotional weight that these kinds of things have. It's not just to shock you, but it's to really hammer home how much of a violation this is, both to Bobby and to Ed. And it's just really, and it does make the hillbilly character even more grotesque, like with his teeth and his screaming. And it's just so grotesque and upsetting. And I knew it would be, but I didn't think just how it's shot is so much more visceral than I had anticipated.
Yeah. When I watched it again, I was interested how long they held the wide shots, and just to me, it gave it a real sense of once again this notion of reality of like, we're not going to, obviously there was cutting. I'm not saying there wasn't, but rather than we're not going to go in there and find these fascinating shots or make it all about the spectacle. It was just almost like an observation at times, which to me is much more harrowing because it feels more real. And they did. They were careful not to show too much of the rape, I guess. But you get so much of the horror of it from the prelude, and just the whole squeal like a pig, and it's just so horrible, isn't it? Just the toying with him, But yeah, the way it was shot for me was that because they kept it wide, and as you say, cut between the three characters mainly. It just felt real. It wasn't playing for cinema magic or cinema style, or it wasn't trying to be sensational in that way. It was just letting it play out in a way.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why I stayed away from the film for so long was because I'm gay, and there's that. For the longest time, this was the only movie that I had heard about that had like male sex. I'm not going to call it gay sex because this is all about dehumanization and all about and that's one thing I did appreciate when I finally did watch it, is this, like, it's all about this power and this kind of dehumanizing these people because he wants them to scream and squeal like a pig, right? And so there's that aspect of it that is just like, this isn't men having sex with men. This is like domination, and we are going to basically do to you what you are doing to our land, is how it comes across. Right. Yeah. But I honestly think that was, for me, one of the things that sort of like lingered in the back of my head the entire time when I was growing up. It's like, ooh, I don't know if I want to see that and see this sort of like sequence played out in that way. But of course, watching it, when I watched it, I'm kind of glad I did watch it as an adult and didn't inform my like idea of sex. But it's weird that I don't know. That whole scene, it's very effectively shot, I think, and because it focuses, as you said, Mary Beth, on the faces and the audio aspect of it, the piggy sounds and all that kind of stuff. It's also interesting that John Boorman directed this and Exorcist 2, which is a weird movie, and Zardoz, because as I was watching this movie, I started to think about how Burt Reynolds is what is that? The
wetsuit with the weird diver websuit.
Yeah, that's strange wetsuit with a zip. Yeah,
it looks like the outfit, almost like it belongs in Zardoz. And I was thinking, is this like a prop for Zardoz? Because it just, I don't know, it just stuck out at me because it does not look like a regular wetsuit.
No, it's so not a regular wetsuit. I'm not sure, because they're all sweating. Like, they've all got these beads of sweat, and he's wearing this wetsuit. You're going, what the hell is he wearing?
I guess Zardoz came out afterwards, so maybe it became like an inspiration for, because it gives me like Zardoz like vibes the entire time. And like, it's hard to take it seriously because it feels a little camp in a movie that is so not camp.
Yeah. It's odd, isn't it?
Well, do we want to wrap this up and give it our rating out of 5?
Sure.
Yeah. Briefly, one of the things that I found fascinating doing research on this, though, I'll be very quick, is this movie ironically increased tourism in Georgia.
Yeah, I heard that.
They went from having, like, in 1972, I guess, about between 7,000 and 8,000 people floated down the Chattooga River, and it tripled the following year when this movie came out, and then reached almost 68,000 in 1989. So like tourism, went up. Rafting and canoeing went up as like a main form of tourism dollars for Georgia. And this movie
banjo sales? Did banjo sales?
They should have. But it also set in motion Georgia as a place for films to be made. Like film production in Georgia ramped up after this.
Because wasn't there a big pushback by the Georgian, whatever you call them, governor, because they thought it'd be bad for the state, and it was absolutely the opposite.
It was absolutely opposite, which is wild to me, considering what happens in this movie. It makes me not want to ever go to Georgia.
Okay, now do we want to wrap up and give rating on 5? Sorry, Terry. All right, Terry, how many Zardoz wetsuits out of 5 do you give Deliverance?
This movie surprises me every time I watched it. I mean, I guess I've only seen it twice, but I was surprised at how lean it is for a movie that's almost 2 hours. Like I think it's about an hour and 45 minutes, but it doesn't feel that way. It has a brisk energy, maybe because they're whitewater rafting through most of it, and so that pacing continues throughout. But I think this movie has a lot more to say about gender and masculinity than I kind of anticipated it to. And I think it's filmed beautifully. I think it's wild that they did all of these stunts pretty much with no stuntmen because they couldn't afford it, was the big thing. So I mean, gosh, I think I'm going to cut one of those wetsuits in half and give it 4.5 wetsuits out of 5. What about you, Mary Beth?
I agree, because I did 4.5 because I know I was so hesitant going into this movie. I knew, we all know like the 2 main parts. And I was like, I'm very interested to see how this is all going to play out. And, it was so surprising and refreshing to see a movie like this that is there to shock, but also is digging into something much more complex and not ramming it down your throat, but really making these characters that at first you're like, I don't know about all this. And then you kind of see them come out of their shells, and as more fucked up stuff happens and you kind of see who they truly are. And, you're subverting this Burt Reynolds masculinity that everyone is used to. And he is like rendered useless for the last half of the movie. And it's so much smarter than I ever gave her credit for. And so I apologize to Deliverance personally that I ever and Don Borman. So yeah, I'm going to have to give it 4.5 Zardoz wetsuits. And then Andrew, you have the final word. How many Zardoz wetsuits out of 5 do you give?
Well, I'm going for banjos.
There you
go. I think one banjo, the conversion rate is. Look, I'm with you guys. I was going to give it 4, but you guys said 4.5, so I'm going to follow the pack.
There we go.
Yeah, it's a film that certainly, especially talking to you guys, it's great that you've stirred up all these other thoughts I hadn't really examined as much. But yeah, I think, it's got a lot of interesting suspense and action. It really packs a punch with that scene, which, I think was revolutionary for its time and resonated for a long time. And it really does make you think about a lot of things. And of course it's in a nature setting, which I love. But yeah, so I really can respond to this film.
I did wonder, because you filmed, on location. Would you ever want to do something like this, like as they did?
Yeah. I think a river would be amazing. Probably sure I shouldn't say that, but
the next movie's coming up.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us to talk about Deliverance. I don't think you have social media, do you? But if you don't, or if you do, where can people find you, and what do you have coming up that you can talk about and share?
Yeah, sure. So I've got a Facebook page for the Reef. It's just the Reef on Facebook. We put updates and stuff. And it's not just about the Reef; it's about most of my films. But I've called it the Reef.
Okay.
And yeah, I've got a film that I'd love to make. I've got a couple, but one that I'd love to make that I'm trying to get up, which is called Melodica Vampire Slayer, and it's a black comedy, and I call it Spinal Tap meets Dracula. So, it'd be...
Oh my God.
I know, every time I say that, I get that reaction. So I know
that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you can use real vampires in that, though. I mean, you don't have to...
Gosh, I hadn't thought of that. I'll have to write in a scene with a banjo now, I think.
Yeah.
I think so. So listeners, you've heard from us. We want to hear from you. What was your experience with Deliverance? You can send us an email at scarredforlifepodcast@gmail.com, or you can reach out to us directly on Twitter. I am at MB McAndrews.
And I'm at Gaily Dreadful.
And of course, don't forget to follow the podcast on Twitter at Scarred Podcast.
And please don't forget to review, rate, and subscribe.
Thank you to Eric Power for our artwork. Thank you to Sean Keller for our music. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please stay safe out there, but most importantly, stay creepy.
And until next time.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
What is The Briefing Room?
It's a behind-the-scenes look at how the criminal justice system works and the lives of the people within that system.
If you love true crime, well, these are the real people who do the job every day of making sure justice is served.
Hi, I'm Detective Dave.
I'm Detective Dan. Together, we have decades of experience in local law enforcement, a profession that we think is often misunderstood.
So we're going to explore how to do it right, and we won't shy away from when it's done wrong. These are stories you'll hear nowhere else. Unique, frank, and unvarnished.
From the team that brought you Small Town Dicks, this is The Briefing Room. Episode 1 drops on August 30th.
We'll meet you in the briefing room.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.